Hello and welcome to the latest video in my Theories of International Relations series. So in this video we'll be talking about feminist perspectives on international relations. So let's begin by talking first of all about some of the different approaches to feminism. So it's important to note right at the outset that feminism isn't kind of a single monolithic philosophy. It isn't a single monolithic approach. There are in fact multiple different strands of feminism, multiple different approaches to feminism, and in some cases feminist scholars from these kind of different strands don't necessarily agree with each other either. So we'll start off by looking at kind of, I guess, the most fundamental division in feminist theory, which would be the debate between essentialist and constructivist approaches to feminism. What do we mean by that? Well, essentialists basically believe that there are fundamental biological differences between men and women. And I'm not just talking about, kind of obvious physical characteristics. I'm talking about the way that men and women think and behave. The idea that men and women have different brains, essentially, that men and women's brains are wired differently, and that these differences are fundamentally rooted in biology. So the fact that women possess two X chromosomes leads to different development, not just physical development, but also the idea that the differences in kind of hormonal development and so on lead ultimately to women's brains developing in a different way compared to men's brains. And again, this is not saying that one is superior to the other. It's saying that basically they are just different, and that as a result of these biological differences, men and women think and act and behave differently. And in particular, the idea that men tend to be more aggressive, tend to be more confrontational, tend to be more competitive, ultimately tend to be more warlike. And that women, by contrast, tend to be more cooperative, more peaceful, more inclined to diplomacy rather than war. And if that were true, and I'm not saying that it is, I mean, again, that's something that I will leave you to consider for yourself, whether you think this is true or not, but if that were true, then it would have obvious implications for international relations. The fact that certainly historically, and to a very large extent today, most leaders are still men, are still biologically male. So if men are indeed inclined to be more aggressive and more warlike, then that has significant implications, of course, for the amount of war in the world. The idea that if more women were in charge, then perhaps we would live in a more peaceful, cooperative world. So that's the essentialist perspective. That ultimately these differences in the way that men and women think and behave, and the implications of that all of that is rooted ultimately in biology, and therefore cannot be easily changed. The alternative point of view is what we might call the constructivist perspective, which what we might call constructivist feminism, which basically says that if there are differences in the way that men and women behave, those differences are rooted in social conditioning. They are rooted in social constructs, different ideas about how gender roles differ, different expectations about how men and women are expected to behave, So any differences in behaviour that do exist are down to social conditioning, not the product of biology. So, again, whether you take an essentialist or a constructivist perspective on feminism, again, first of all, do you think that men and women behave differently, and that men are, in fact, more aggressive and more warlike? And if you do believe that, do you think that's down to biology, or do you think it's down to social conditioning? Again, I'm not going to offer any views on that. I'm going to leave that as an exercise for you to think about for yourselves. Well, that's the essentialist versus feminist essentialist versus constructivist debate within feminism. So yeah, there are in fact multiple feminisms, and the kind of essentialist versus constructivist debate is just kind of one aspect of that. But beyond that, there are multiple different feminist paradigms. So perhaps the most widely widely recognised or widely occurring form of feminism would be liberal feminism. And very often when people talk about feminism, they mean liberal feminism. They're referring to ideas about equality between men and women, which hark essentially from a liberal feminist paradigm. So liberal feminism essentially is not particularly revolutionary. Liberal feminists are not trying to sweep away the existing political and social and economic order. They are simply trying to increase women's participation in it. So a liberal feminist would say, okay, we need more female politicians, we need to get more people elected, more females elected to positions of political authority. We need more women in the workplace, particularly in kind of leadership roles. The goal is equality. Basically, the goal is equality between men and women. So it's not a revolutionary approach, in that it's not trying to overthrow the existing order. It's simply trying to increase women's participation in it. And again, I think this is the form of feminism that we most often encounter, and that we most often think of as feminism. But it's not by any means the only strand of feminism. And some of the other strands of feminism are more radical. So if we look at, for example, Marxist or socialist feminism, Marxist feminism, socialist feminism is a revolutionary approach, and it argues that the real cause of women's oppression is ultimately capitalism, and that women will never gain full emancipation under a capitalist system. So again, without going into depth, where are they coming from with that? Why would capitalism be more sort of oppressive of women than men? Well, first of all, of course, as Marxists, they believe that class struggle is kind of fundamental to an understanding of history and an understanding of society. Men also are oppressed. Men of the working classes, men of the proletariat, are also oppressed. But women in particular are oppressed arguably even more in lots of different ways. So, for example, the kinds of roles that women have traditionally played in society, and again, things are changing now in many countries, but the kinds of roles that women have traditionally played in most societies. So, for example, raising children, for example, domestic management, running the household, and so on. These duties, although when you stop thinking about it, these things are just as important for society as any other kind of work. Arguably some of the most important, roles in society that there are. Raising children, and without children, there is no next generation. There is no continuation of society. So we can argue that is one of the most important roles there is. And yet these roles, traditionally performed predominantly by women, have not been recognised under a capitalist system as work. And they've not been rewarded as work. You don't get paid a wage for being a parent. Women have not been paid a wage, for example, for looking after the household. And yet the argument is that these roles are important not just to society but to capitalism as well, because again, capitalism, what does capitalism need to survive? It needs workers, it needs labour power, and the next generation of workers are the children, who again traditionally were predominantly raised primarily by women. So in essence, women are being used as an unpaid army of child rearers, without any proper recognition or without any proper compensation for that role. So this is the idea that capitalism, yes, oppresses working class men also, but particularly exploits women even more. And again, as Marxist feminists would say that the only way to overcome that is to overthrow capitalism. The only way that true emancipation will ever be achieved is to overthrow the system. So obviously fundamentally different from liberal feminists. Marxist feminists are not simply seeking to increase women's participation in a capitalist economy. They are seeking to overthrow the capitalist economy because they see this as the only way to secure true emancipation. Radical feminism is similar in some respects, in that it is a revolutionary approach, and arguing that true emancipation of women is not going to happen unless there is a fundamental revolutionary change in society. But whereas capitalism is the thing that Marxist feminists want to overthrow, to radical feminists it is the patriarchy. The patriarchy being the most fundamental, the oldest social structure, the oldest kind of system of domination and subordination and oppression of one group by another, much older than capitalism, been around since perhaps the dawn of civilization. And the idea that it is this kind of oppressive regime of the patriarchy, which is the fundamental social structure which must be overthrown to achieve emancipation. But once again, a revolutionary approach, the idea that society must be fundamentally transformed. The last two are a little bit different because these kind of are more linked to, to epistemology and understanding of how theory is built, but they are particularly important for understanding, the relevance of gender, particularly to IR theory, and how arguably gender has impacted on the way that traditional IR theories are constructed. So first of all, the idea of standpoint feminism. Standpoint feminism is the belief that there is such a thing as a woman's perspective or a women's perspective on the world, and that men and women experience the world differently, but that the voices that we usually hear are male voices. In the media, in academia, in political life and so on, we kind of tend to hear the male voice most often. The male voice, the male concerns dominate, and that women's voices are kind of, sidelined and not heard. So let's take, for example, if we talk about, war, the idea that women may experience war differently to the typical male experience, because certainly traditionally, again, things have changed, in some states in recent decades, but traditionally wars were in the main fought by men. Yes, there have been female warriors throughout history, but they tended to be the minority. Most soldiers were men. But women tended to experience war differently. Very often, women were more likely to kind of be um, to be vulnerable, to become refugees, to face things like organised rape used as a weapon of war, um, and also to end up in roles like kind of nursing roles, having to deal with the sick and wounded, with the casualties of the battlefield and so on. So the idea that women experience war differently, and in some ways have been kind of more vulnerable to some of the horrors of war. I mean, not that men have not been kind of victims as well, but the idea that women, have faced particular dangers and particular experiences, and of course the idea that women are kind of, maybe pregnant or maybe have young children to worry about in the midst of war as well. All of that, the idea that women experience war differently, and that those voices, those women's perspectives on war, have not been heard. So we read a history book and we read all about battles and generals and victories, and in some cases stuff that almost glorifies war. But the idea that the women's experience of war is not being heard, has not made it into the history books in the same way. So, and again, we're not just talking in terms of war and peace, that's just kind of one example, but more broadly, the idea that international relations, international politics has been understood from a male perspective predominantly, and that particularly traditional IR theories, such as especially realism, has been written from a male perspective and reflects male concerns. So the idea that if we want to have more complete international relations theory, we need to hear women's voices. We need, otherwise our understanding is incomplete, because we're only seeing half of the picture. We need the other half of the picture in order to understand the world more comprehensively. That's the standpoint feminist kind of approach. Postmodern feminists would kind of deny that there is such a thing as a women's view of the world, or a men's view of the world for that matter, because they would argue, postmodern feminists would argue, that there are as many different women's viewpoints as there are women, and as many different men's viewpoints as there are men. That in other words, reality is made up of a multiplicity of different experiences and perceptions and values and views that kind of defy easy categorization. So this is kind of a refutation of the idea that there is a women's perspective and a men's perspective. But standpoint feminism, I would say, is particularly important to the debates in international relations theory about the relevance of gender to international relations. That takes us on to talking about stereotypical hegemonic masculinity, which is a bit of a mouthful. I believe the term was coined by Raewyn Connell back in 1987-ish, or at least that's the earliest reference that I've come across. It may have been used earlier by someone else, but that's the earliest reference I've come across. But what do we mean by stereotypical hegemonic masculinity? What is stereotypical hegemonic masculinity? And again, particularly relevant for our purposes, of course, how might it influence IR? How might it influence the behaviour of leaders? Well, stereotypical hegemonic masculinity basically is the perspective that there is an idealised image of a real man, that men are conditioned from birth. They are expected to live up to this masculine ideal. And again, I'm sure we're all pretty familiar with it. The idea that a real man is strong, a real man is tough, a real man never backs down, a real man takes no shit from no one, a real man is always ready for trouble, he's always up for a fight, a real man doesn't show any weakness, he doesn't show any emotion either, except maybe anger. He certainly doesn't show himself to be vulnerable in any way, emotionally or otherwise. And if you don't live up to this ideal, you are not a real man. And again, in most cultures around the world, there may be some exceptions, but in most cultures around the world throughout history, we have had this idealized sort of vision of what a man should be. And we see it in Hollywood all the time. John Wayne is kind of the classic archetype, I would guess. Not that John Wayne, to kind of younger viewers, John Wayne is not your generation. He's not even really my generation. He was more kind of my granddad's generation. But we see, the same thing in kind of latter day action heroes. Hollywood, every action flick practically that comes out of Hollywood with a male lead pushes this same kind of stereotypical ideal of what the male hero should be like. A man's got to do what a man's got to do, as John Wayne put it. And we see political leaders deliberately trying to cultivate that sort of image. Best example I can think of is Vladimir Putin. We've seen him kind of, on a regular basis riding around with his shirt off and, fishing in icy rivers with, spears and things and wrestling bears and whatever it is he does. He's kind of deliberately promoting this image that I am the strongman leader. Don't mess with me. I'm the tough guy. And this is very deliberate. And so, and again, we see the same kind of thing in other leaders as well. I think of Donald Trump, for example. Okay, Donald Trump doesn't ride around with his shirt off, but it's that same kind of almost kind of in-your-face masculinity that these leaders are keen to kind of cultivate that image. So we go from the image of the idealized man that then becomes transposed to the idea of the idealized leader. So the idea that a real leader is strong, a real leader is tough, a real leader never backs down, a real leader is always ready for trouble, up for a fight. He doesn't kind of seek to de-escalate and calm things down and be diplomatic. A real leader is kind of in your face, taking no shit, and showing no weakness. And again, if that is true, if that is the expectation, and again we can see the obvious kind of links back to kind of constructivist feminism, the idea that leaders act this way not so much because of biology, because of or testosterone or anything like that, but because the men in particular have been conditioned from birth to kind of view this as the ideal image of the man and therefore the ideal image of the leader. We can see the obvious implications of that for international politics and for war and peace in particular. But what happens if the leader happens to be biologically female? Well, the idea is that because this masculinized image of the leader has become the idealized image of the leader, that even if the leader happens to be biologically female, she's still expected to behave in this masculine way. She is expected to be tough and strong and take no shit and all the rest of it. And if she doesn't act that way, she's not going to be taken seriously as a leader. So, and again, looking back over history, we can find lots of examples of warlike female leaders. And this is not an exhaustive list by any means. These are just a few examples. So, if we think about Boudica, for example, who, led the rebellion against the Roman occupation of Britain and very nearly ended the Roman occupation of Britain. The story of Boudica is one that I've always been kind of quite fond of myself, and she certainly was not a lady that I would like to mess with. Joan of Arc, of course, the kind of teenage girl, really, not even an adult woman. The teenage girl who kind of led French troops in the late medieval period against the English in the 100 Years' War. Catherine the Great of Russia, Golda Meir of Israel, Indira Gandhi of India, Margaret Thatcher of the UK. All of these tough, strong, warlike female leaders. But again, arguably, they had to be that way because they were operating in a man's world, if you like. They were operating according to rules of, of politics, of political life that emphasised strength and war and so on. And so these female leaders, had to operate within these existing rules. So yeah, the idea that female leaders inevitably have to adopt stereotypical masculine ideals of how leaders are expected to act. And again, that's arguably true not just in politics and not just in international relations, but also in areas like business as well. The idea that to succeed as a business leader, for example, a woman has to kind of, act in this kind of competitive, tough, take no shit kind of way. Because again, this is the expectation of how a leader should be. So whether or not the leader is biologically male or biologically female, this masculinized image of how a business leader or a political leader should act is the expectation. And if you want to be a leader, you have to operate within those rules. So now let's start to look at some of the most important contributors to feminist theory in IR, and also start to think a bit more about feminism's overall contribution to IR and to IR theory. And in particular, let's start to think about how traditional IR theories, and particularly realism, might be critiqued from a feminist perspective. So we'll start off by looking at Cynthia Enloe. So Enloe was one of the most important pioneers, really, of feminism in IR. Her first kind of really seminal work, Bananas, Beaches and Bases, came out in 1989. And it was around that time, kind of late 80s, when feminism started to come to the fore as a mainstream IR theory, along with a number of other critical perspectives, such as critical theory and constructivism and post-colonialism. All of these kind of critical paradigms started to become more mainstream at this time, kind of late 80s, end of the Cold War kind of period. And feminism was one of those critical perspectives. So of course, feminism as a political philosophy had been around for a lot longer, but as far as IR theory was concerned, feminism only started to become mainstream from kind of late 80s onwards, and Enloe was one of the big pioneering contributors to that. So the main points that Cynthia Enloe made were kind of the points that we've already covered earlier in this video. So the idea that behavioural gender differences flow from packages of expectation. So Enloe is not coming from an essentialist perspective. She's not coming from the idea that men and women are behave differently because of fundamental biological differences. Rather, she's arguing that men and women are conditioned to behave differently and perhaps to think differently because of cultural expectations, packages of expectation, as she puts it, around gender roles. And again, she makes the point that women leaders tend to act like their male counterparts because they are expected to do so in order to be taken seriously. So again, this idea that the sort of masculinized image of the ideal man becomes the image of the idealized leader, the expectation that a leader has to be tough and confrontational and all the rest of it, that becomes transposed onto the idea of what a leader should be like, and therefore even if the leader is female, she's still expected to behave in this way in order to be taken seriously as a leader. Enloe also kind of asserted that omitting women in IR theory leaves IR with a political analysis that is incomplete or even naive. So again, that's related back to this this idea, which I guess is linked to standpoint feminism, the idea that there is a women's perspective on the world which is different to a male perspective on the world, and that conventional IR theory has ignored the women's perspective. And because of this, we only have half an analysis, half of a picture, if you like, because we are not taking into account the perspective of half of the global population. And kind of linked to this, Enloe is interested in kind of the everyday experiences of women, from the grassroots up, so their experiences of politics, of society, particularly on issues like war and peace, the idea that the women's voices need to be heard in order for IR to give a complete analysis of the world. The other sort of really important pioneer of feminism in IR is Jeanne Tickner, and she began her kind of contribution to IR theory around the same time as Enloe, so kind of late 80s going to the early 90s. She is still active in IR scholarship. I believe she's in well into her 80s by now, I believe, but she hasn't retired. She is still active in academia. And Tickner began with the question, where are the women in IR? And she's not kind of just talking about where are the female leaders, but where are the female IR scholars, and where are the women's perspectives in IR, because she kind of saw this as a glaring omission in IR theory. So again, this idea that the woman's perspective on the world has been absent from traditional IR theory, resulting in an incomplete analysis. Like Enloe, again, Tickner puts forward this idea that aggression and power politics flow from this kind of stereotypical masculinity, these sort of stereotypical masculine ideas of how men, but ultimately leaders, are expected to behave, and that commonly accepted definitions of security are built on this idealized masculinity. Strategic discourse, in other words, the way that IR conventionally thinks about war and peace and security, is all built on this idea of strength and confrontation and deterrence and so on, which kind of, again, in Tickner's view, flows from this stereotypical masculine image of how leaders are expected to behave. So in other words, realism, with its kind of focus on competition and militarism and conflict and domination and strength, again, realists see this as just the way the world is, whereas someone like Tickner would say, well, that's looking at the world through a male lens. If you look at the world through, again, this kind of idealized masculine lens, then those are the kind of attributes of a leader and features of the system that you're going to focus on and going to emphasize. So realism, far from kind of being a universal theory, is kind of a narrow perspective, if you like. It's a perspective which views the world from a very narrow kind of masculinized lens. And Tickner also kind of seeks, therefore, to redefine security. So if security is not all about militarism and confrontation in kind of the traditional sense, then how should we think about security? How do we redefine security? And feminists like Tickner, rather than focusing on the military security of the state, tend to focus more on the security of people, which is not the same thing as the security of the state. So the security of people as individuals. So the idea of human security. Now, I must point out that the concept of human security and a focus on human security is not exclusive to feminism by any means. But nonetheless, feminist scholars like Tickner have made important contributions to this kind of broader view, or very different view of security compared to the traditional realist idea of security. And again, feminists like Tickner would also focus in particular on the experiences of women in war and conflict, which, as we've already said, may be quite different to the experiences of men. So Tickner believes actually that militarism is often the cause of insecurity, and she argues that security means nothing if it is based on others' insecurity. Tickner believes that progress needs to come from thinking differently about security and redefining security and power as well, but we'll come on to power in different terms, in feminist terms. So Tickner asserts that a feminist definition of security would involve the elimination of all types of violence based on socially constructed ideas of domination and subordination in everything from domestic life to the international sphere. Now again, you may think that that's a pretty tall order, and you would be right, but I guess you have to start somewhere, and the point is that in terms of the elimination of all types of violence, we're not necessarily just talking about physical conflict. Tickner is talking on kind of a deeper level with that statement. So, what exactly does Jeanne Tickner mean when she talks about the elimination of all types of violence? Well, in order to answer that, we need to think a little bit more deeply about what is meant by violence and how we might reconceptualize or broaden our conceptualization and our definition of violence. So usually when we talk about violence, we are talking about something physical. That's the way that we normally think about violence. So anything from a punch in the face, a knife in the ribs, a bullet, a bomb, all the way through to nuclear missiles, I guess. We're talking about a physical attack that causes physical harm. Now that type of violence is what we might refer to as direct violence. But there is also arguably another type of violence. And by the way, this again is not exclusive to feminism. This distinction between direct and indirect violence is not exclusive to feminism. But I include it here to kind of explain what Jan Tickner means when she's talking about elimination of all types of violence. So the idea of indirect violence refers to actions and practices and social structures and so on that cause harm. So not necessarily a physical attack, but an action or perhaps an inaction, or again not necessarily an action or inaction by one individual, maybe something that is bedded into the system, maybe something that is bedded into the social structure of the system, but something which causes harm. And that includes all forms of inequalities and discrimination and injustices, for example. So this takes us on to the idea of structural violence, and again this is not specific necessarily to feminism per se. It's actually Johan Galtung who kind of talked about kind of the phrase of structural and cultural violence. So structural violence again is action or patterns of inequality or injustice, for example, which are built into the structures of a society, which produce unequal power relationships between people or between different sections of society, the unequal distribution of resources flowing from the unequal distribution of power, I guess, and these problems with the social structure causing harm to sections of society. That is what we mean by structural violence. Cultural violence is those aspects of culture within a society which kind of legitimates and reinforces structural violence. So again, this kind of links to the stuff we talked about when we talked about critical theory, and we talked about constructivism. We talked about how power imbalances are ultimately rooted in hegemonic cultures, hegemonic ways of thinking. So, for example, if we think about the subordination of women, that ultimately has been rooted in a set of attitudes in society which have been broadly accepted, challenged by some, but generally broadly accepted for a very long time, which kind of dictate that men and women play different roles, and the idea that men are in some ways superior and men should be in charge. And this was broadly accepted, including by most women. Again, there were some women throughout history really who have challenged that, but the majority of women kind of accepting that and going along with it. And it's these kind of underlying embedded attitudes within the culture of a society which have created and reinforced and perpetuated the subordination of women. So another example of structural violence might be hunger. Again, a lot of my students are often quite shocked in a sense when I point out that each year approximately 5 million children in the world starve to death or die of illnesses which are related to malnutrition. 5 million kids every year are dying because they don't have enough to eat. That's just the kids, that's not even counting the adults. And in total, it is estimated that approximately 1 in 8 people in the world do not have enough to eat. 60% of the world's hungry are women. This is partly because mothers very often kind of go without food themselves or without adequate food themselves in order to feed their children. And yet, you know, it shouldn't be this way because there is enough food for everyone. The world agriculture produces enough food every year to feed everyone on the planet. So if there is adequate food, why are 5 million kids starving to death every year? And the obvious answer to that is because the food is not equally distributed. There is a problem within, the global organisation and distribution of resources, which means that some get more than their fair share and others don't get sufficient even to survive. That is a very good example, very shocking example, but underlines what we mean by structural violence. So cultural violence, again, we just talked a little bit about how cultural norms and assumptions may be taken to legitimate indirect violence. So again, the idea that inequality is natural, if some people are kind of poor, that is a good thing because it will encourage them to work hard and become entrepreneurs and start businesses and so on, and this will promote economic growth. So again, particularly not exclusive to the United States by any means, but the United States is an example of a society where that attitude prevails. The idea that some races are biologically or culturally superior to others, straight up racism, again, throughout much of the world historically, that attitude has dominated. Throughout kind of Europe and the United States, the Western world, racist attitudes were very widespread until quite recently, and of course still exist, but not so widespread as they once were. But if you go back 50 or certainly go back 100 years, racist sort of attitudes, assumptions of racial and cultural superiority were pretty much the norm among not all but most Europeans at that time. And again, we see similar attitudes, for example, in China in the present day. And not just China. I'm not simply picking just on China. Again, that's just one example, but similar attitudes in other countries as well. The idea that violence is a honourable way of settling disputes. We'll sort it out like men. Again, we see that all the time in Hollywood movies, for example. The idea, again, that a man has a right to assert power over a woman and is socially superior to a woman. Again, that attitude is seen in much of the world historically, and even today still persists. Kind of flowing from that, the idea that a man has a right to correct or kind of discipline female behaviour. So we see that, again, certainly historically in Europe, but today we see that attitude in, again, not just these countries, but examples of countries where these attitudes remain quite strong among significant sections of the population. So India, Nigeria, China would be some examples of societies where these attitudes are still quite strong. The idea that physical violence is an acceptable way to resolve conflicts within a relationship, and linked to that, the idea that intimate partner violence is a taboo subject, and reporting abuse is disrespectful. So again, don't interfere. If a guy is beating his wife up, that's a private domestic affair. And even in the UK, that attitude prevailed until just a few decades ago. The police kind of tended to be reluctant to intervene in what they called domestics, because it was seen as a private thing, not a public thing. And very often, until not very long ago, just a few decades ago, the police, even in the UK, would be reluctant to intervene in cases of domestic violence. The idea that a man's honour is linked to the behaviour, particularly the sexual behaviour of his female relatives, his daughters, his sisters, perhaps his cousins even, and that deviation from expectations by a female member of the family disgraces the family and therefore justifies honour killings. Again, we see that in various societies around the world. Jordan is given as an example, but many other societies around the world. The idea that sex is a man's right in marriage, again, seen in countries, for example, like Saudi or Pakistan, but again, in Europe as well, until, again, pretty recently. It was only, I believe, if I remember rightly, it was in 1990, when a High Court judgment in the UK ruled that a man could be convicted of raping his wife. Because kind of prior to that, the assumption, the received wisdom in the UK was that once married, a wife does not have the right to refuse, that a man has the right to have sex with his wife whenever he wants it. And, you know, that was the assumption in the UK right up until near the end of the 20th century. The idea that reporting assault or bullying is cowardly and dishonourable. You don't grass, you know. That attitude is still seen today, for example, in the UK. And the idea that being raped or being the victim of sexual violence is shameful for the victim, and therefore the victim should keep quiet about it. Again, we've seen that in various societies around the world, and still kind of persisting to this day. So these are all examples of ingrained attitudes which have caused harm or have allowed harm to take place and have kind of dissuaded people from doing anything about it. So that's what we mean by cultural violence. So again, coming back to feminism, coming back to Tickner, again, this stuff is, you know, is not exclusive to feminism, but this kind of explains where Tickner is coming from when she talks about security, meaning the elimination of all forms of violence. She's not just talking about the elimination of physical violence, she's talking about the elimination of those social structures and ultimately those attitudes which cause indirect, or which constitute indirect violence as well. So in other words, security and emancipation are two sides of the same coin. You cannot have real security while some people are oppressed. Emancipation is security. Which again is a quite different way of thinking about security than the realist definition. So emancipation, of course, is the freeing of people, both at an individual level but also at a group level, from those constraints which stop them from living their best life, if you like. Stop them from carrying out what they would freely choose to do. So war and the threat of war certainly is one of those constraints. But so is poverty, so is, you know, lack of adequate education, political and social oppression, unequal societal structures and power relationships. Ultimately, all of this, you know, provides the constraints, the problems within society which create insecurity. So again, think back to what Tickner said about security means nothing if it is based on the insecurity of others. So that's security, but J.N. Tickner also, in particular, other feminists as well, goes on to kind of redefine what we mean by power. What we mean by power as well. So, again, what does a realist mean by power? To a realist, power is the ability to dominate others, to coerce others, to make others do what you want. So if actor A causes actor B to behave in the way that actor A wants, then actor A has exerted power over actor B. Power is domination. That's the realist definition of power. But Tickner offers an alternative view of power. Power has been the ability to get things done by working collaboratively with others. So the idea being that we will achieve a lot more if we work together rather than if we are at odds with one another. So power, from Tickner's perspective, Tickner talks about power with rather than power over. The idea of collective power through collaborative effort, the power to achieve things, which we would not necessarily be able to achieve if we were working at odds with one another. So power with rather than power over. Okay, so that really covers the major tenets of feminism. There's more to it than that, as there are with all of the theories that we've looked at, but those are kind of the main points. So again, lots of kind of key questions arising from this, and again, I'll leave it up to you as to how far you agree with these points, but certainly key points for discussion. So again, this idea that men are inherently more aggressive and more warlike while women are inherently pacifist, is that true? Do you think that's true or not? Do you think that male leaders are kind of part of the problem? The fact that leaders tend to be male, does that does that in itself lead to aggression and confrontational behaviour? And if more women were in charge, would we have a more collaborative society? If that is true, if you think that is true, if you think that men are inherently more aggressive and more confrontational, why is that? Is that down to biology? Do you take an essentialist position on that? Or is it down to expectations and social conditioning? Is it this kind of idea of the idealized man being a certain way and being the tough guy and so on? Is that kind of at the root of expectations around how men and ultimately how leaders are expected to behave? And again, if that is the case, then ultimately what we have to do is change the ideas and change the expectations, because simply having a female leader isn't necessarily going to isn't going to provide a solution if the female leader feels that she has to behave in the same way as the male leaders. Ultimately it's this idealized, masculinized ideal of the leader which needs to be challenged if that is the case. So what do you think about that? Do you agree that a woman's experience of war and conflict might be different to a man's? And if so, in what ways? And more broadly, do you think that it's fair to say that women have a different perspective on global politics compared to men? And again, if that is the case, what are the implications of that for IR scholarship and IR theory? To what extent are traditional IR theories, such as realism, built on a male view of the world, or an idealised male view of the world? And finally, what do you think about these feminist redefinitions of concepts such as violence and power and security? Do you think it makes sense to redefine those terms in different ways, in feminist ways? So that's all for this video. Once again, as usual, if you have any thoughts or comments on that, then please feel free to put those in the comments section below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all on the next video. Thanks very much.